Hi, welcome to My Favorite Mistake. I'm Mark Graven. We're joined today by Neil Daswani. Among other things, he is the co-director of the Stanford Advanced Security Program. He has a PhD in computer science from Stanford, and he has a book that's going to be released at the end of February called Big Breaches: Cybersecurity Lessons for Everyone. So Neil, thank you for joining us today. How are you?
Hi, Mark. I'm doing quite well. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, well, you're eminently qualified to talk about the subject of cybersecurity, and I assume as the book does, our conversation about that, you'll make it understandable for all of us.
I will do my best to speak in English all the time, and if you see me veering off track, just let me know.
Okay, sure thing. It would be a mistake, I guess, if there was too much jargon that we didn't understand.
Yes.
But as we normally do, Neil, before we get into some of those other topics here and have conversations about all of that, thinking back to work you've done, what would you say is your favorite mistake?
Sure. Well, I'd say that my favorite mistake was back when I was in graduate school. I was taking a database course, and one of my professors had set up a new grading system that I think another student had coded. And I, being, of course, in computer security and very naturally curious, I effectively hacked into his system. I identified that it had a particular kind of vulnerability where if you log in just after the administrator logs in, then you were given administrator privileges and would be able to change people's grades, change their assignments, do all kinds of things. And that's my, and so the mistake was that, once I got in as an administrator, I changed the administrator's password to the word correct to prove that I had in fact broken the system. And that was the mistake. That was my favorite mistake. It was my favorite mistake because I learned a lot from it. The professor was furious, absolutely furious.
I was wondering what was the aftermath of this, but go on.
And I was afraid I was going to get suspended or expelled. And I had CC'd my advisor when I had emailed the professor about the vulnerability in the system. And my advisor came to my defense. Hector Garcia Molina had the Digital Library Project, and the guy that bought Larry and Sergey their discs. Thanks to him for coming to my defense and allowing me to complete my PhD. The mistake was that I had changed the administrator's password. If I had simply alerted him as to the vulnerability and maybe had a meeting with him and showed him how the vulnerability worked, but didn't make any changes to the system, I don't think he would have been as upset. So that was my favorite mistake.
So other than what, did you just get kind of a scolding or some threats or just a little bit of anger thrown at you? Was that really the worst?
The worst of it was I got a slap on my wrist and was told not to do it again. And I learned from it. I learned about when you find security vulnerabilities in real systems, even if it's something as innocuous as a grading system, people can get very upset. And so how one manage the situation after that in such a way so that you don't make any changes, but still demonstrate the vulnerability and how to fix it was just very important.
Is there, I guess amongst quote unquote hackers or security professionals, I mean, is it a matter of kind of like a code of how to go about these things?
So over the years, there's a concept called responsible disclosure that has arisen. And the way that responsible disclosure works is that when you find such a vulnerability, you let the organization that runs the system know about it. And you give them, you first of all, of course, don't make any changes to their systems explicitly or inadvertently. And you give them appropriate time. The two parties should come to agreement as to when is a reasonable time to have it fixed, and when is a reasonable time to talk about the vulnerability after it has been fixed. And so that's what responsible disclosure is all about.
And so, we talk about after that responsible disclosure takes place. And I wanted to ask a follow-up question, in this case here with the grading system. A, did they update the system? And B, did you check to see maybe, how long it took, if it indeed did get fixed?
So yes, they did fix the system. They fixed it pretty fast. And I did check, but I went ahead and I let the professor know, hey, I'm gonna check. So if it tickles any alarms or whatnot, it's because I'm checking.
Did they tell you not to check?
Yeah. No. They didn't say not to check. I think the other thing that's important is that when you do check, you seek permission and you get authorization. Mm-hmm. And I would also say that if you're a security researcher, you're looking for vulnerabilities, to only do these things on test systems, and not the actual production real life systems, because you don't just know you don't know what havoc you can possibly wreak. Yeah.
Wow. Is there? I've heard terminology, white hat versus black hat. Hmm? Were you coming at? And can you explain those terms a little bit? You were coming at this as a quote unquote white hat hacker. You were just curious. You weren't trying to do any harm, or you could have, I guess, right?
So that's correct. So I was coming as a white hat hacker, and so white hats are typically the good guys that are trying to defend systems. Black hats are the bad guys that are trying to find the vulnerabilities and break in and then do malicious things. And so I have always been a white hat, and I've learned how to become a better white hat over time. And I think given some of the escapades in my career, whether it have been having progressed from being a security researcher to a security product developer, to a founding CEO of a startup, to a chief information security officer of a public company, I've certainly gotten better about how to be a white hat. But I think that I also believe it's important to embrace the habit of continuous learning and always continuing to become better.
Yeah. Now that you're on the professor side of completing your PhD and you're teaching, is any of the quote unquote white hat tactics taught formally in any classes, or is this just sort of part of quote unquote hacker culture and things that people learn from each other as their kids or students or what have you?
So as a co-director of Stanford's Advanced Security Program, I do instruct, I do teach classes. I'm not a full university professor or tenured or anything like that. One of the things that I love about the Stanford Advanced Security Program is that I co-direct that program together with John Mitchell and Dan Bonet. John Mitchell is the head of the computer science department currently, and Dan Bonet is a world-renowned luminary in computer security. I bring the industry influence to that program. One of the great things about doing that is there has been more and more instruction over time on teaching people how to think like the black hats, but operate always as a white hat. And in our courses and in our labs, we do teach people how to break into systems. We give them all the appropriate advice, only do this on test systems and whatnot, but we do teach them techniques on how to break in, whether it be how do you exploit a SQL injection vulnerability? How do you exploit a cross-site scripting vulnerability? And I realized I just stopped speaking English there for a few seconds.
Hey, I mean, this topic and everything may have attracted an audience who knows exactly what you're saying.
But bottom line, I think it is important to teach people how to be a good white hat. And by the way, there's some companies that, for instance, hire people that have been black hat hackers in the past. And at the various companies that I've worked, and over time, I've worked at Google, I've worked at Twitter, I've worked at LifeLock, I've worked at Symantec, I've worked at a whole variety of organizations. But my view on that was always, very influenced by some of the people that I worked with at Google, who had the mindset that, if somebody has, in the past, been on the black hat side, and there's questions about their ethics and their morals. You just may never know when they're going to switch sides again. Now, I think there's some, counterexamples to that. I think, Kevin Mitnick, who's one of the most well-known hackers of all time, now.
I even know the name.
So, you even know the name. Good, good, very good. Yeah. So I'd say there's certainly counterexamples, but for instance, when you look at various companies like HackerOne or BugCrowd or Synack, these are companies that run bug bounty programs where they work together with companies and they hire a whole bunch of ethical hackers. They hire people from all kinds of backgrounds. And because they're coming from all kinds of backgrounds, some of the best such companies will make sure to do all kinds of psychological analyses on prospective hackers that they invite to their platform, because you just never want to be in a situation where someone finds a vulnerability and they just don't tell you about it. They kind of stockpile it and they can use it later for, they could sell the vulnerability, they could use the vulnerability. So I think, the ethics and morals around this sort of stuff is just really important.
Yeah. Is this where the phrase, I've heard the phrase, 0-day vulnerability. That means something has just been discovered, it's day zero, it's still exploitable, it needs to be fixed.
Yes, that's correct. In the world of security, there are known vulnerabilities where somebody has found a vulnerability and they've reported it, and it's now part of the National Vulnerability Database, and there's likely a patch available to fix the vulnerability. Those are known vulnerabilities. There's also unknown vulnerabilities which have not been discovered yet by anybody, right? All software has bugs. There's a certain class of bugs that can result in security vulnerabilities. And we may not always know what all the bugs are. We may not always know what the security bugs are. So those are the unknown vulnerabilities. Then there's the situation that you described where somebody discovers a vulnerability for the first time, and perhaps informs the entire world about it, including the organization that has the vulnerability. And it is day zero. Nobody has any time to react, to come up with a patch, and that vulnerability could be exploited at will. So those are indeed 0-day vulnerabilities.
Yeah. So somebody, discovering this and then, bragging about it online in some form would seem like not fall under that responsible disclosure set of code and guidelines.
That is exactly right. The way that responsible disclosure would work is when the security researcher finds the vulnerability, they inform the organization, and the organization and the individual agree upon an amount of time with which the vulnerability should be fixed. And then the researcher only talks about the vulnerability afterwards, so that, even if, the vulnerability is found, and it kind of might be a 0-day, right? The company didn't know about it. Nobody else knew about it. There is time to fix it, and that 0-day isn't available to the entire world to exploit. So yes, the right protocol to follow is a responsible disclosure protocol. Now, there are some researchers that decide to go directly to the press when they find a vulnerability, which gives the organization 0 days to react. It, by the way, also puts important sensitive consumer data at risk, and puts consumers at risk, because you could have a real attacker, a nation state attacker, a cyber criminal that could also then just start using the vulnerability right then and there.
Mm-hmm. Building on this idea of responsible disclosure, how much responsibility is it? Let's say in the case of Stanford, like clearly what you had hacked into, they didn't hold it against you. You got your PhD, you're working there. And I imagine they're not going to be upset with you telling the story after the fact, because what's there had been patched. But it's still kind of embarrassing to say, well, this happened. How much How much ethical responsibility is it for a department or a university or a company to share this vulnerability with others who might be also at risk?
So I think it is an important responsibility. So depending upon the nature of the vulnerability, and in this particular case, I mean, this was a vulnerability that I think I had found, pre 2004. And it was just in one system. It wasn't the main Stanford University grading system. It was a system that was being used by just one professor for his class.
Mm-hmm.
And so the ramifications were not as significant.
Okay.
Many organizations, Stanford included, have seen much worse, hacks, compromises, breaches. But this particular story I talk about in the Foundations of Security book that I published back in 2007 when I was working at Google. So yeah, there's no reason for the university to get upset about this particular thing, and they've been through much more significant things. But I think that whenever a researcher finds a vulnerability, it is important to let, let's say that you find a vulnerability in an open source software package. It is important to let the developer of that open source software package know about it, so that they can fix it, because chances are there might be a lot of organizations that are using that open source software, and there could be a lot of people at risk. In fact, if we look at what happened in 2017 with the Equifax breach, there was a vulnerability in a piece of software called Apache Struts. And Equifax, as well as many organizations, use Apache Struts as part of their software development. And there was a vulnerability which basically would allow an attacker coming in from anywhere on the internet to basically issue commands of their choice to a system that was running Apache Struts. And there was a patch available, made available, and it is really important for every organization that then uses that vulnerability, that uses that software, to patch that vulnerability as soon as possible.
Yeah. So, I mean, most recently in the news, the SolarWinds breach is probably the highest profile one that's occurred here recently. Can you talk about that situation? What's known about causes of the vulnerability, how difficult that's going to be to fix? Or I don't even know. Maybe first question is, what is this SolarWinds software that so many were using in the government, I believe, in the military, also in the private sector?
Sure, I'd be happy to talk about SolarWinds. So SolarWinds is a company that makes available many products for information technology purposes and also security purposes. And SolarWinds has a product called Orion that's used by 300,000 customers to monitor the performance of certain information technology systems. What happened is that, as we're all very well aware, software systems need to be updated from time to time. What happened in this particular case is that a foreign nation state actor was able to inject malicious code into one of those software updates, and into particular versions of Orion. So out of the 300,000 customers, there's about 17 or 18,000 that were using the vulnerable version of the Orion IT performance monitoring software that had this malicious code injected, and it allowed the attacker to pretty much take over that system as well as others. There is a lot of interesting technical detail and a lot of interesting aspects of how it happened. One of the interesting things was that SolarWinds, some of the components of their software, some of their software libraries that made up their software package, was in the past getting flagged by antivirus companies as potentially being a virus, potentially being malware. But of course, it was legitimate software. So what SolarWinds I think did is work with the antivirus community, and a number of antivirus providers whitelisted, meaning they gave that library that was getting flagged, they gave it a free pass.
So those warnings were rationalized away, or it's a false positive, was
yes,
their assessment, I guess.
Yes, that's correct. And unfortunately, it was given a free pass. So when the nation state actor decided they wanted to inject malicious code into that library, they knew that their malicious code was going to get through because that component was given a free pass. So I think that there's many learnings from the SolarWinds attack, but that was one that you should not necessarily give out these kinds of free passes.
Wow, I didn't know that aspect of the story. Gosh.
Yeah, and there's a lot of interesting aspects of the story. On one hand, SolarWinds has been called the digital Pearl Harbor, but I think it's important to keep in mind that Pearl Harbor was a complete surprise. This, however, was a third-party supply chain compromise, right? Because many organizations use SolarWinds as a third party, and the initial vulnerability was in this third-party software. But SolarWinds is definitely not the first third-party supply chain compromise. If we think back to some of the biggest breaches that have occurred, if we look at the Target breach in 2013, where over 40 million credit card numbers got stolen, Target got compromised because they had a third-party supplier by the name of Fazio Mechanical Services. It was the supplier that controlled the heating and air conditioning in all of their retail stores. And Fazio Mechanical Services had some of their network credentials stolen. And that is where the breach started. The attackers, because the Target network and the Fazio Mechanical Services network were tied together, the attackers were able to breach Fazio Mechanical Services and then go on to pivot and breach Target. So that was one example. And then just the very next year, JP Morgan Chase in 2014 had a breach. I mean, they were spending over $250 million annually on security. They got breached because of one of their third-party suppliers by the name of Simco Data Systems that was running a website that was responsible for their nonprofit charitable marathons. So there certainly have been third-party compromises in the private sector in the past. But even then, so in 2015, the government's Office of Personnel Management got breached. 20 million government employee identities were stolen in that breach. And that was due to a third party by the name of Keypoint Government Solutions that helped the Office of Personnel Management do some of their background checking. So third-party compromises are not new at all. What is new here, though, is the scale and the scope of the third-party compromise. And so while there have been a whole bunch of indications of the kind of seriousness of attack that could occur, it's expected that the number of organizations affected here have just been much larger in the past due to third-party compromise.
Yeah. And you mentioned Target and Equifax. I think I've got lifetime free credit monitoring, I think, because I know I was part of those two. And the Office of Personnel, I think that also affected anybody who was in database for security clearance and even people who had been interviewed as part of that. So I've got that's just a short list of things I think I've been caught up in, thankfully to no known ill effect, but it's not great to receive that notification.
Yeah. And it's great that you got credit monitoring for things like the Target and Equifax breaches. Credit monitoring was also given out in the Office of Personnel Management breach. But it did affect, like you said, it did affect more than just employees. Anybody that got background checked and say perhaps wasn't hired yet or didn't get hired, whatever, they were also part of that data set. But I'll tell you, I was surprised that credit monitoring was the tool that was given out to people for, I don't know, a year or two, because the threat is much more significant with all of the identity data that was stolen. And effectively, when people apply for certain government jobs, they fill out these SF-86 forms. And it has, not just your name and your social number, social security number, and your address, but it has all that information of all your family, friends, and neighbors that got interviewed as part of that background check. It has things like the results of psychological analyses. It has information on, drug history, where'd you live, whatever. And so if you think about if a foreign nation state wanted to mint spies in this country, right, or have people in the country and have them get jobs at government agencies, that is exactly the data set that you want to steal. And credit monitoring, by the way, only protects your credit. It does not protect your assets. It does not monitor, your cell phone account, your bank accounts. And so identity theft protection would have been a much better thing to give all 20 million government employees. But given the scope of that breach, the question is, what are we doing to make sure that spies are not getting minted? And so, in the congressional hearings that took place afterwards, there were statements made saying that, this is the biggest blow to counterintelligence efforts that had ever taken place, and that it'll take generations to recover from. What's done is done. And we've got to, there's no mending what happened here in the past. We've got to figure out how to look forward.
So that one follow-up question, that vulnerability of injecting code in there, is that something that exists? Does that same vulnerability, how much does that apply to other software systems? Maybe that's unknowable, or is this a learning? Yeah.
This applies to many, many, many systems. As we know, there's many software systems that regularly have to be updated. And I think that for organizations that are affected by SolarWinds, it's important to not, by the way, I don't necessarily know that we should be casting blame on SolarWinds, right? I think, I think because this is an issue that every software vendor has to deal with. And, I think once things get looked into, it'll be interesting to see what gets learned about, SolarWinds specifically. But in general, any software organization that is sending out code updates, especially when their software is running with administrative privileges, there's many, I guess, tens of thousands of software vendors that could be susceptible to the same sort of thing.
Couple quick questions before we wrap up. And again, our guest is Neil Daswani. His book is Big Breaches, Cybersecurity Lessons for Everyone. Kind of rapid fire questions here. So I use the Chrome browser and I use the password manager. And I get these notifications that have started popping up saying, your passwords on 34 different accounts have been compromised. Is that a mistake to ignore those? Should I, right after this recording, go look at that list and go update passwords where I can right away?
I think it would be good to go ahead and update, your passwords. What's been happening is that a lot of databases of passwords get stolen and they get put up on the dark web. And the attackers have these huge, corpus and repositories of stolen passwords. And the first thing that they do is try and use them. What I would also recommend, right, is to use two-factor authentication, to use two-step verification for any and every online account that offers it, especially with things like banking websites. So when you log in, you don't just apply a password, but a 6 or 8-digit code is sent to your cell phone, and pretty much you have to enter that code as well. So just because the attackers stole your passwords over from the dark web doesn't allow them to log into your accounts. They also need to then compromise, your cell phone too.
Right. And I do use on a number of accounts the Google Authenticator tool, which I think provides a deeper level security. To your point, Neil, if they were to also somehow clone or steal my phone, that Authenticator app, I'll tell you, here's a mistake I've made. And I've done it twice because I don't update my iPhone that often. when you if you wipe your old phone and then you install Google Authenticator on the new device, that creates problems. Like there's a particular way you've got to sort of port over permission. So it's good security, but if as a user you make a mistake about how you manage that, you spend a while rebuilding your two-factor authentication. So that's one of my mistakes.
Yeah, that's right. But you know, it's not a like I think as technologists and as an industry, we need to make this easier for users, right? And by the way, the reason that problem existed is because there was a secret that was only known to your old phone, and if it's done right, that secret should not be portable to the new phone. You know, even using authenticators in general, though, right? When it gives you these 6-digit codes or whatnot, you still have to be aware that you can be susceptible to a phishing attack, right? Because just like an imposter website can ask you for your username and password, an imposter website could also ask you for the 6-digit code, right? And then the imposter website can send that information to the real website and log in on your behalf. So the best defense is to use what's called a security key, where it's a piece of hardware. It sticks into your laptop or your phone. There's many folks that manufacture these things. Yubico is one of them. And what it does is it requires that you have this piece of hardware, and you can keep it on your key, your key ring or whatever, but you plug it in when you're logging in, and then it authenticates you based on a secret in that piece of hardware that is not phishable. You can't type the wrong thing into an imposter website. I would, and by the way, you can also use your phone these days as your security key. So Google has made available an advanced feature where you can enable two-step verification and have your cell phone be the security key that allows you to log in.
Good tips. Neil, one final question. This is kind of a silly one to end on. So when I was a kid, War Games was a very popular movie. Remember liking that movie. Is that a mistake to watch? Is it a mistake to watch that movie, do you think? Or are you a fan?
War Games was an awesome movie. It is definitely not a mistake to watch War Games. In fact, when my kids are just a little bit older, I want them to watch that movie, because I think it was one of the I think it came out in the 80s. It was one of the first movies that made it so apparent as to, by taking humans out of the loop and just relying on automated computer systems to be able to launch nuclear missiles, here's what can go wrong. And I'll tell you, having a PhD in computer science, sometimes I'll tell you, if it's between a computer spitting out an answer with an algorithm and listening to a human, sometimes you want to listen to the human. So I think it's definitely not a mistake to watch War Games. I think there's another great lesson in War Games in that, I think even today with artificial intelligence systems are still learning a whole bunch of things. And there may be some things that AI algorithms may not be able to learn. And I think, at the end of War Games, it was just great that the computer was able to learn that the game of global thermonuclear war was not a game that you could win, just like tic-tac-toe. And so definitely not a mistake. Great movie to watch.
Okay, so I'll maybe rewatch that sometime soon. So Neil, thank you so much for telling your story about your mistake of hacking into that system and the way you went about it. So thank you for sharing that, and thank you for sharing some other I think really interesting thoughts about mistakes that organizations or individuals might make related to cybersecurity. So the book, again, by Neil Daswani is Big Breaches, Cybersecurity Lessons for Everyone. Neil, thank you so much for being a guest. Really enjoyed it.
You're very welcome. Thank you so much for having me, Mark. I really enjoyed the time.